bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
What time frame are we looking at now from when it hits the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour at 60 miles up? What's the time frame from that point, roughly speaking, to when it slows down to 200?
It's about 10 minutes.
It's got to be about 10 minutes. That's a lot of stress on the vehicle, the spacecraft. And it has to dissipate at the same time that heat that it generates because of the friction when it hits the atmosphere. There's one other point, Marcus. You may see we go down so many rabbit holes here. Can't help it, folks. This is just the nature of this subject. And I will wrap up chapter 9 in a second here. There is one other aspect to what you're talking about. You mentioned that they come in at an angle of 6.5 degrees, and this factors in all the supposed moon rocks that they were bringing back, and this gets into weight and balance. Now, weight and balance is a factor when you hit the atmosphere, especially when you hit the atmosphere. That's when all the four forces come into play. So if you're hitting at 25,000 miles per hour, you're hitting the atmosphere at an altitude of 60 miles up. You're coming in really fast. It's like smack into the atmosphere. What, in terms of the thrusters, was the Apollo guidance computer capable of adjusting the thrusters in order to keep that angle at the angle it should have been, in order to, because either way, they either skip out of the atmosphere or they burn up if it's not precise. That's what I'm getting at. And from what I've been able to determine in my own research over the last several years is that the Apollo guidance computer wasn't designed to maintain that angle. It didn't have that capability. I mean, we're not talking about an autonomous computer here. We're talking about a computer that needed by NASA's own mission, needed input from the astronauts. So if they got into a situation calculating the average moon rocks, it's different for each mission, but on average, it was about 140 pounds extra. That's on average. So it might have been 70 pounds for one mission and then 200 pounds at the next mission. I'm just averaging it out. And you average it out. How did the Apollo guidance computer compensate for the weight and balance, if there was a weight and balance shift? Because if you have a shift, and once you hit the atmosphere, you're in trouble. And I have not been able to find any literature talking about that specific aspect of how the Apollo guidance computer was able to adjust the thrusters to maintain 6.5 degrees.
There isn't any. The reason that NASA give is that they designed the craft, the command module, in such a way that it entered so that it, let me get this right. It entered with the heat shield end first, and it was supposed to be coming in at an angle that would allow the craft to basically fly through the atmosphere. That's probably not a very good way of explaining it, but as you say, the Apollo guidance computer did not have the capability of keeping up with the speed the craft was traveling at, 25,000 miles an hour, and slowing down. It's moving very fast indeed. That's 40,000 kilometers an hour. I mean, we're talking high speed stuff here. It's very difficult to control it. So they had to rely on the aerodynamics of the command module to maintain its angle. Now, you'd think that the obvious answer would be, right, bring the craft in, bounce off the atmosphere, like skimming a stone across a pond, bounce off the atmosphere, and come in at a slightly reduced speed. But they didn't do that. That's called a skip re-entry. Apollo didn't do a skip re-entry. The Soviets did. Their craft came in on a skip re-entry. And another point that is not often commented on is that when the Soviets cosmonauts landed, they couldn't walk, they couldn't stand up. They had to be literally taken out of their spacecraft on a stretcher.
Yes.
But the Apollo astronauts jumped down and they were in the boardroom or the mess room of the rescue ships giving speeches and eating cake.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. But if they'd
No.
only come back from Earth orbit, that would be a reasonable thing to be able to do. Coming back from the moon, they've been on the moon in the case of Apollo 17 for 12 days. They've been in zero gravity until they hit the atmosphere when the gravity loads are anything up to 9G. I mean, that's almost lethal.
Yeah.
That level of gravitational attraction, to suddenly come into that level of gravity from zero, which is what was happening on the way back from the moon.
I want to add one thing to that. Very good point. It's the age factor. Fighter pilots, you usually get fighter pilots in their early 20s, and 20, 25, mid-20s usually, because they're physically better able to take the forces, because they do a lot of G-forces and maneuvers when they're, either practicing training or in war, when they're in a fight with another aircraft, or they're trying to get out of the way of a missile attack, right? So a heat-seeking missile attack. So they're pulling a lot of Gs. Now, the astronauts, we're talking astronauts here that were in their late 30s, and in some cases, I think some were in their early to mid 40s, correct?
They were certainly more than mid 20s.
Yes, and that, for me, has always been a red flag, Marcus, because of the impact. We were just talking about re-entry, the impact.
Yeah.
It would even have more of an impact the older you are. It's kind of like a boxer. A boxer's at his prime in his 20s. When he gets to his 30s, he's no longer in his prime. We saw Muhammad Ali manage to get to 37 and win a fight, right? And win his last fight against Leon Spinks. And at that time, Muhammad Ali was 38. He made a comeback 2 years later when he was 40, but he wasn't physically able for it anymore.
No, he wasn't.
For a 40 is young, but for a boxer, it's old. And I liken that I use that analogy with the Apollo missions. And just what you were talking about there, when they're, on the moon for two weeks, almost 2 weeks, 12 days, but almost 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden they're exposed to almost 9 Gs and re-entry. Then you factor in their age. It's surprising that we actually believe that people believe they would survive that, because people don't know the details, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's details like that which are not really publicized very much. You sort of watch the films, read the books, look at the magazines, because there's a lot of information out there about Apollo, but you only get the good stuff. You don't hear the problems.
Yeah.
It's as if it's propaganda, which it is. I mean, Apollo was propaganda. Now, if anybody listening knows differently from what we've been saying, please tell us. If I'm wrong on any of the points I make, I want to hear about it. Don't be rude. Don't call me names. Just give us the information. Give us the evidence to prove that we are incorrect when we say that photographic film can't work in space.
You and I are members of the Seniors Club, so all the folks out there that want to criticize us, be gentle, right?
Yeah.
Marcus, we're going to wrap up with chapter 9 here. I marked out this paragraph because it sums up your work in chapter 9.
Yeah.
And it's the last page 74, very last paragraph. Well, just to sum it up here. And I'll just read it here. And because it's a good closing paragraph for the work that you've done in chapter 9 regarding the sun. The evidence is clear. The suns that we see in the Apollo photographs and videos cannot be the real sun. When we compare photographs of the real sun with those of the sun on the Apollo images, then the difference is clear. If the Apollo sun is not the real sun, then we are entitled to ask what it is. And I think that really kind of sums it up. And for the viewers out there, I really do encourage you to watch the Apollo Detectives channel when Robert adds video to this. But also go on Google and just check it out for yourselves. I mean, don't take our word for it. And look at the sun. Look at other photographs of the sun. Compare them to the photographs from the Apollo missions of the sun. and you will see a distinct difference. One is obviously the sun, and the other one's obviously a spotlight, a very powerful spotlight. So one thing that we didn't get into in this, and we will later on, because I know from reading the book, it's later on, it's the intense heat caused by the lights that were used to film the Apollo missions required a lot of cooling to keep the astronauts cool, hence the source of why the flags were waving. So we'll get to that part a little later. But let's move on to chapter 10, because I really want to get to this one, because this one is, I actually wrote this up in my second book too, because it is a very interesting topic, another interesting topic regarding this. Now I'm going to read the first paragraph. That is chapter 10, Sun versus Earth size, and that's page 75.
Okay.
Actually, what I'm going to do is go to the next page here. So what we're talking about here, I just want to generalize the first paragraph before I read the second paragraph. What we're talking about is when you look at the moon from the Earth, and then you look at the Earth from the moon, you're not seeing what you should really see. You do see, of course, I'm not talking about the moon from the Earth, but when you look at the photos and you see the Earth supposedly taken from the lunar surface, something doesn't seem to be right. The Earth seems to be a bit too small, considering that the Earth is 4 times larger than the moon. So therefore, common sense would tell you, well, you should see an object in the sky from the lunar surface that's 4 times larger than the moon. But that's not what you see. You see the opposite, right? So that leads into page 76 and the paragraph at the top, and I'll read it for the viewers here.
Okay.
But there is a much easier way to show that the Earth images shown on the Apollo photographs are far too small, which is just what we talked about. The visual sizes of the Earth and the Sun can be related one to the other by reasoning as follows. And you've listed down 3 points, and I'll read the 3 points here. Okay. 1, the first point. The sun and moon, when viewed from the Earth, look exactly the same size. This is why we see the total eclipse of the sun by the moon when the moon covers the sun almost perfectly. And that's a fact. It is, from the perspective here on Earth, it's the same size when we look at it from our perspective, right? Number 2, the sun is to all intents and purposes equidistant from the Earth and the moon, so it will look the same size when viewed from either. And number 3, and this is the key point, the diameter of the Earth is 3.66 times that of the moon, so it should be the same factor larger than the sun in the Apollo photographs when viewed from the moon. And you clearly can see it here. I'm going to show this photo to the viewers. So it's on where my thumb is here. You can see the, I think that's Apollo 17, where my finger is here. On the right, and look how small the moon, the Earth is. It's smaller than, it looks smaller than what the moon looks from Earth, and it should clearly be the other way around.
It should be, yes.
Yeah.
It is. In fact, we show what it should look like on the next page, on Apollo 14 image. Okay,
let me get to that. Apollo 14. Yes, actually, that I was going to show that. So.
Okay.
So here we have Apollo right there, Apollo 14, and you can see what the Earth should look like. And in fact, it should be you should be looking up in the sky from the lunar surface, and it would actually almost frighten you. It's so big. It would be huge. It would be awe-inspiring. Like you would just be going, wow, right? But you don't see that. You don't see that at all. And here's it again for the viewers, just so as they can see it for themselves.
Yep.
Yep.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's not what we see in any of the photos. Actually, to be honest, we see very few photos of the Earth, which is stunning. Which is stunning to me, because if I was on the moon with a camera, I would be taking hundreds of shots of the Earth.
Yeah,
I'm saying that's our planet. Look how big and blue it is. It would be like you would be looking up in awe. You'd be looking at this huge, but no, you see a pebble in the photos, right?
I do.
You
Yeah,
know,
true.
yeah.
It
That's what you see.
it just doesn't look right.
No,
It-
it doesn't. And I have yet to hear anybody explain. By the way, we're only going to talk about that one point there in that chapter because that really covers it all. But I have yet to see anybody explain to me why that is. And they tried all kinds of things like, the camera this, the camera that, the angle this, the angle that, the atmosphere, the no atmosphere. None of it makes any sense. None of it adds up. None of them have been able to explain that strange anomaly. And you have a couple of pages in here which gets the reader thinking. I also talk about it in my second book. I think I put it in the appendix.
Yeah.
But it is something that has always, like, when you look at the Earth from the moon, I just, like, I'm not impressed. Like, I just like it should be bigger,
Yeah, it should
right?
be. Of course
It should be. It's 4 times the size of the moon. It's 25,000 miles wide. The diameter of the Earth, 25,000 miles.
Yeah.
All right. It should be. It should fill up, your camera. I mean, not literally, but it should be a huge object. It should be just looking right at you there. You can't get away from it. You don't see that in any photos, and I find that very strange. And I think it could have something to do with the fact that they don't want too much definition in the photos of the Earth.
Yeah.
You could actually pinpoint the time that the astronauts took that photo and then check the weather patterns. This is just speculation on my part. Check the weather patterns of that, detailed photo of the Earth, check the weather patterns. And if they don't mix, if they don't match, there's something not right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
So
somebody allegedly has done that. Some of the NASA fan club has done that, and they've looked at the weather patterns on the day that the pictures were taken and say, yeah, it matches. The cloud patterns match. Well, they don't show any evidence for it. They just say it matches. Anybody could say it matches, but you've got to come up with evidence. Say, this photograph of Earth was taken on such and such a time, such and such a date, and this was the weather pattern. Here's a photograph taken from the moon, the same thing. Yeah. That's the
Apollo 17 right there again for the viewers. There's Apollo 17. I don't care how much you magnify that if you can. You're not going to get the detail you need to make a determination whether that was what the cloud patterns were that day. So you're right, and I'm assuming that person who said that didn't show any weather charts for that day and time to back up what he was saying.
No, he just said it. It's called it's called an assertion.
An assertion.
He asserted.
I assert he's wrong.
Yeah, well, yes.
Yeah.
I think you're right there.
But I mean, it's just amazing. It's just amazing. So that's I want to move on to chapter 11 because I want to cover some ground here today. And this chapter now is kind of getting back into what we were talking about previous, but now we're actually talking about the lights of the moon. Now, with this particular chapter, we're going to try to show you as much visuals as possible because it really helps with the narrative. But again, you can Google this, and of course, Robert on Apollo Detectives will have the visuals for you. So we're going to go to chapter 11, Marcus. Chapter 11, Lights on the Moon.
Yep. Lights on the Moon, yep.
And I want to go to page 85.
Okay, good.
Okay, so page 85. And I'm going to read your paragraph, the second paragraph down, page 85. And one of the most, right there.
Yeah, got it.
One of the most perceptive Apollo researchers has been Jet Windsor. Jet is an American filmmaker producing and directing the award-winning film Moon Hoax Now. In that movie, he identified an instant in Apollo 16 at Station 2 in which the existence of an artificial light is revealed. Now, you have an app in here that the reader in your book can go to look at this light. So I'm not going to read that out here, but you provided an app so the reader can check it for themselves. I want to read the second paragraph. In the video extract, that next paragraph.
Yeah.
In the video extract, you see two shadows that cross over the entire set. NASA has made it abundantly clear that no artificial light sources were taken to the moon, so the only light source on the lunar surface was from the sun. The video shows two gigantic shadows crossing over the entire scene all the way to the horizon. These are definitely shadows, as we also see a shadow cross over the backpack of the astronaut. The interesting thing about these shadows is that they come from opposite directions, and that's the key to the viewer, is they come from opposite directions. That would be impossible if the sun was the only light source on the moon, and that's the point I want to emphasize here. The shadow coming from the right is from the direction of the sun, but there is nothing large enough to move that could cause such a shadow, a huge shadow. The shadow coming from the left has no natural explanations. The only conclusion is that there are at least two large artificial light sources that cause these shadows, and that proves without any doubt that the Apollo astronauts were not on the moon.
Yeah. That's a good point. Good point made by Jet Windsor, and it's certainly worth checking out his film, Moon Hoax Now. Explains it in detail. Now, one explanation for that, you mentioned the huge shadow. One explanation for that could be that the set we're looking at and the astronauts involved on that set. The astronauts were mannequins, and the set is a miniature set, which would account for the huge shadow, because the light source would almost certainly be a big electric light, tungsten light, and somebody just got in the way of it, and that would make the huge shadow. It's a point that is quite often overlooked, that many of these scenes are miniatures. They're models.
Yep.
The lunar rover is almost certainly a model when you see it moving. The Apollo landing is almost certainly a model, but there's no means of telling if it is a model because there's nothing to compare it to. There's nothing on the lunar or the alleged lunar surface that we as humans, because we judge size by comparison with other objects. You know, if you see a car next to a house, you can see pretty well the proportion between the two things. The house will be much larger than the car, obviously. But on the moon, we got no means of determining its size because there's nothing to compare it to. I mean, a rock is a rock. We don't know how big the rock is. Maybe the rock is a foot high. Maybe it's 10 foot high. We don't know. Unless there's an astronaut standing next to it and we can compare the size. But this particular chapter is basically to do with shadows and lights on the moon. And the point that is necessary to know is that we've got two eyes, so we see with stereoscopic vision. A camera has only one lens. So to see a photograph taken of a three-dimensional object like the lunar surface or shadows on the lunar surface, the alleged lunar surface, we see them in two dimensions. So the perspective is different. There will appear to be converging or diverging shadows. And when they're taken in a photograph, although the shadows will be parallel, all shadows are parallel, when you're looking at a photograph of those shadows, it's taken with one viewpoint, the camera lens, not the human eye, which is two, which will give you the three-dimensional image that we see. The camera doesn't see a 3D image. And so the shadows will appear to converge or diverge. So that is a point quite often not fully understood when you're looking at these photographs of the lunar surface and the shadows on it, they appear to be strange. It's because we're looking at a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional object. And you can, I mean, the classic example is of railway lines. You know, if you take a photograph of a railway line, they appear to converge into the distance. They go to a vanishing point. But we know perfectly well that a railway line is parallel for as far as you can see. It's the difference between the perspective from the camera and the perspective produced by the human eye. It's very straightforward. It's very simple.
That's a very, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, there are certain things you do need to know about optics, which is what a camera records, or how a camera records, and the three-dimensional viewpoint that we as humans have. And we tend to confuse the two. We say, well, that's not what I would expect. And there are various photographs. There's a photograph here which shows just shadows produced by obviously vertical and parallel doorways, but the shadows are diverging. Or no, sorry, the shadows are converging. Well, they appear to come together, but that's purely an artifact of the photograph. It's not real. But normally, when we look at a photograph, we almost automatically compensate for that particular view. So we see a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional object, and we automatically compensate for the fact that the shadows appear to converge or diverge, depending on which angle it's at. If you photograph them at 90 degrees to the shadows will be parallel. So, but there are several photographs. There's one particular one, Apollo 14, which shows on page 83, Apollo 14, that's the one that appears to show shadows that are diverging.
That's the photo that I want to discuss, and there's another photo too. I remember 10 years ago when I was researching the Apollo missions, I was reading a review on Amazon for David Percy and Mary Bennett's book, Dark Moon, good book.
Classic book.
Yes. And what was interesting though about the reviews were good, but what was more interesting is that there was a person on there who was countering the reviews in the comment section. Now you were able to do that. You were able to write a comment about the reviewer's comments and you can counter his, right? And he was going out of his way on this very particular, subject himself, talking about, well, if you look at the lines converging, it converges here on Earth and it converges, you see it converging on the moon. That's normal. That's this. What he never mentioned was the lines and the shadows that he was trying to counter the argument that Percy and Bennett were putting forward, but he would never talk about the shadows where you see here on page 83. It looks like there's a difference of about maybe, I don't know, let's see, maybe 40, 50 degrees in those two shadows. Yeah. Right. And if you look at some of the other photos, you actually have shadows that are 90 degrees to each other. That has nothing to do with what this man was trying to do, this countering David Percy and Mary Bennett's argument about this and the views for the book. He stayed away from this. Like they never go near this. They've never tried to explain why there is what. So what are you telling me, that the shadow bounced off the rock and turned left? That's kind of where they're going with this. And no, that doesn't work. Whether it's a vacuum or whether it's on here on Earth in an atmosphere, two converging lines means two light sources. Two shadows 90 degrees to each other means two light sources, whether it's here or whether it's on the moon. It's two light sources. You can't get away from that. Your sound, I think your sound, Marcus, if you can hear me, your sound. Yeah.
It's all right. I turned it off
Oh.
because the phone was ringing.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But it's all
So
right.
I think that's a very valid point. Nobody's been able to explain the converging lines. Yes, I've seen that they're trying to counter that and trying to
Yeah.
justify why that is, but they've never been able to justify shadows at 90 degrees to each other. That has never, or in this case, it looks like 40 or 50 degrees, the one that you posted in your book here.
Yeah.
But they've never been able to explain that, so they stay away from it for the most part. It'll be interesting to see the comments down below when people see this video, which will be in probably 3 or 4 parts.
Yeah, it should be. But
Yeah.
It's a subject which is often discussed. There's a great deal of discussion about shadow angles and so on. And it's a matter of understanding not just the shadow angle, but how that is recorded on the photograph you're looking at. I mean, that picture you showed there of Apollo 14, 689486 is the number.
Yeah.
My conclusion on that is that that is a model of the lunar lander.
Yes.
And there's an astronaut in there as well, just to the left of the lander. Quite hard to see it. But another point on that is those rocks in the foreground.
I see it, the astronaut. Yeah, I see him.
Yeah, but the rocks in the foreground.
Yeah.
Isn't it strange how the shadow of the rock is completely black? There's no detail visible at all. And when you compare that to the Apollo 11 photographs.
So what you're talking about, I'm going to put my finger there for the viewer.
Yeah.
You may not, if I can get the closer there, see where my finger is. Look at that rock in the shadow. Am I blocking with my finger? Can they see it, Marcus?
Yeah, that's fine. I can see that.
Yeah, and it's black, and that's what Marcus is talking about. Why is that?
Yeah, why is that when we're told that the lunar surface reflects enough light for the camera to pick up detail in the shadow? That's the argument against the Apollo 11 Aldrin coming down the ladder photographs. He's lit up like a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
Why is he lit up like a Christmas tree when those rocks don't have any detail at all in the shadow?
Exactly.
It makes no sense. Maybe whoever staged that photograph hadn't thought of that.
Again, it goes back to, and just to close this chapter, it goes back to, because we're making good progress here, Marcus. It goes back to what I had said earlier, is that they have never been able, I've never heard, here's the thing, when the pro-NASA people come at us, each one of them has a different explanation for what we're talking about. They're not unified in their explanation. It's everyone's different because they're guessing. We're not guessing. We're actually asking questions. Why is that so? You haven't come back with a valid answer. You've come back with several different answers to the, I'm talking about the critics, but they haven't come back with one unified answer. Yeah. And NASA doesn't even, just ignores it. It leaves it, that NASA's clever. They leave it up to their minions to do all their dirty work for them and all their footwork for them and fighting and back and forth. But they have never been able to come up with one unified reason as to why shadows in the Apollo photos are 90. Some of them have shadows that are 90 degrees to each other. That's just, correct me if I'm wrong. I'd be interested to read your comments, but I haven't seen a valid explanation for that. None of us have.
No, none. And just one other point on that picture itself.
Yep.
There's a major article on the AULIS, that's AULIS.com website, where they look at that photograph and they do, it's a scientific procedure. It's called ray tracing. Now on that big rock in the foreground, if you take the end of the shadow and draw a line across the top of the rock that would create that shadow, you've got a ray that can be traced back to its source. Same with the other ones. But if you look at the lunar lander and you do the same thing with that, they don't go to the same place at all. which indicates that it's either a composite photograph or there's more than one light source. And why is the sky, which should be black and dark, why has that got all sort of light in it as well? That makes no sense. The sky in space, assuming it is in space, which we know it isn't here, the sky in space is black. You won't see stars in the sky because the camera can't record it. The stars are too dim if you're exposing for the directly illuminated surface of the moon.
Marcus, do you see, I don't know if this is the photo, but do you see on your, take another look at that photo, AS14, page 83. Yeah. I see, is that what you're talking about? Just above the horizon, it seems like a light source there. Like it looks, it's lighter than it is on the right. Like I'm putting my finger here.
Yeah.
Let me just, right there. It's lighter from the perspective of the viewer. If you go to the right, it's darker.
Yes, it is.
That shouldn't be.
No, it shouldn't be at
uniform.
All. Yeah. I mean, either it's the whole.
Can the viewer see that okay, Marcus?
Yeah, I can see that. That's fine. Yeah, it shows it very clear.
Yeah. That shouldn't be. That's another anomaly here.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's on the original film, the original photograph. So I mean, if it's not, but it looks like it is. So I'm not an expert at photography, so definitely leave that up to you, Marcus. But that appears to be another anomaly that I just noticed when I was viewing it, looking at it.
Yeah. No, I mean, that would appear to be, if it was taken here on Earth in a studio or in an enclosed space, with a black background, which is what you'd expect to see on the moon, maybe the light just got a little bit close to that, and the difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side was picked up by the camera. It's the variation in intensity of light. It's almost as if there was a light above the background, which maybe had something to do with the shadows on the rocks in the foreground.
That's interesting, Marcus, because we can wrap up chapter 11 because this now leads into chapter 12. This is the perfect lead in.
Like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line.